Liberal leader Mark Carney was hard-pressed to answer why he oversaw sending billions in Canadian investments to offshore accounts in Bermuda while he worked with Brookfield Asset Management.
A recently announced Liberal candidate has a history as a climate activist advocating for the carbon tax and calling for an end to the oil and gas industry.
Canadian border officials do not have the tools necessary to crack down on illicit tobacco trafficking and organized crime. Hello Canada, it's Friday, March 28th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Clayton, Demaine.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Liberal leader Mark Carney defended his decision to invest billions of dollars into offshore bank accounts in Bermuda on behalf of Brookfield Asset Management by saying he understands how the world works. Carney came under fire from reports for placing exorbitant sums managed by his former company into offshore bank accounts, which enabled investors to avoid paying taxes. When asked by a reporter whether he thought his actions were ethical, Carney responded by saying that he, quote, understands how the world works and is well versed in global finance. According to information obtained by Radio Canada, Carney's former role as a co-chair for Brookfield saw him investing funds worth $25 billion into offshore bank accounts in Bermuda and elsewhere. The funds were for net zero carbon economy projects, which allowed investors to enjoy the perks that come with harboring vast wealth in tax havens. Carney was further pressed on what the advantage was of first funneling the money through Bermuda, and his response left many puzzled.
I understand how the world works and the structure works, and have the ability to put in place all of the necessary rules to ensure that the appropriate taxes are paid here in Canada, as is the case in the example that you just gave. The taxes are paid. Ils sont payés ici au Canada. Okay, d'accord. Ensuite.
Hi, Mr. Carney. Tom Parry with CBC. Could I just follow up on that? Could you explain in the case of those Brookfield funds, like what was the argument for registering the funds in Bermuda? Is it ethical to do that? And is it something as Prime Minister that you'd have to crack down on? I'm not sure if it's a problem, but is that something that you'd have to crack down on?
I think the important thing, Tom, is that the flow through of the funds go to Canadian entities who then pay the taxes appropriately, as opposed to taxes being paid multiple times before they get there. So that's how we have the structure. That's the structure that all of our pension funds, par exemple, the Caisse de dépôt, or Ontario teachers, or OMERS, municipal employees, or all the big pension funds in Canada, which are very successful, which protect union workers in many cases. I'm speaking of union workers today, and supply to them.
Financial assets and his dealings with Brookfield have been a thorn in Carney's side since he first entered the Liberal leadership race, after he repeatedly refused opportunities to disclose his own finances. This has become a reoccurring issue for Carney, and we're about well into the first week of the federal election campaign, and it keeps rearing its head. And he's constantly asked by reporters, by the opposition, about his finances. Now, Clayton, how has Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacted to Carney's refusals to disclose his own assets and existing business ties?
So Poilievre decided to set an example for Carney after announcing that he sold all of his investments in foreign economies and reinvested more into the Canadian economy. In a statement, Poilievre's team said he updated the ethics commissioner on the changes to his investments, which will be confirmed by the commissioner's office after the election. But before the ethics commissioner will have that report for Canadians to read, Poilievre shared his current investments with City News journalist Glenn McGregor, who then shared the list of investments along with their descriptions. So in other words, Poilievre shared his updated list of investments before being required to do so by the law, which should add some pressure to Carney to do the same. So Poilievre's updated list included investments into two separate Vanguard index funds, which invest into the Canadian economy, into Purpose Bitcoin ETF, which is a registered Canadian Bitcoin fund. Poilievre also holds 5,674 US dollars worth of Bitcoin. His top stocks are reportedly now in RBC, Shopify, TD Bank, Enbridge, and Brookfield Corp, with a small amount in Brookfield Asset Management, the Canadian investment firm that Carney formerly chaired. He listed the foreign investments he previously held as well in a company called iShares, MSCI, which was in Singapore and Switzerland. And he divested from non-Canadian investments in Vanguard as well, and from the American Century Investment. So that's obviously a US investment company, which he divested from due to the tariff spat with Trump. The Liberal Party has acclaimed an outspoken oil and gas activist to represent a central Ontario riding, despite recently advocating for a fossil fuel ban and pushing for a carbon tax. On Wednesday, the Liberal Party acclaimed family physician Dr. Neil Thomas in the Haliburton-Kawartha Lakes riding. Thomas is a longtime climate activist who frequently posts about her disdain for Canada's energy industry and conservatives. Just over a week before the Liberal Party appointed Thomas as the candidate for Haliburton-Kawartha Lakes, she shared a petition urging Liberal leader Mark Carney to build a, quote, people's power grid for renewable energy instead of investing in pipeline projects. In the post, she wrote, quote, tell PM Carney to champion a people's power grid and deliver bold action on affordability, climate, and energy independence in the face of U.S. aggression. The petition from the left-wing environmentalist advocacy organization 350 Canada calls on the federal government to create a nationalized energy corporation, expand renewable energy production, and reject oil and natural gas projects and pipelines. In January, Thomas attended a climate protest affiliated with 350 Canada in Haliburton, Ontario, where she gave a speech calling for a global carbon tax and praised its efficacy.
We must dial back the heat track we are on by increasing the price on greenhouse gas emissions globally. Guess what? That's a carbon tax because it works to increase awareness and reduce use. And we must simultaneously provide abundant, affordable, dispatchable, clean energy. Among other things, Mr. Hansen calls for young people. Where are the young people? To grasp the situation and reset their behaviors. But we need to set the example. Get on board. They, young people, don't have a choice.
She also called on all Canadian policymakers to move towards immediately banning the consumption of all fossil fuels. So, Cosmin, are there any other Liberal candidates who have a past as climate activists or have advocated for anti-energy development policies?
Right. So the most recent one I can think of is former Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson, who was announced by the Liberals as a star candidate. Now, he was mayor of Vancouver for about 10 years, but while he was in charge of the city, he made a name for himself as a staunch opponent of energy development. While Vancouver's mayor, he spent hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars on consultants to fight the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, called it a disastrous risk, and even supported protests against the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. As well as natural gas, he championed policies to ban it in Vancouver by 2050, policies which are being put in place in other cities today. Long before Ottawa even floated such proposals, or it became a fad, so to speak. So his tenure as mayor reflects a deep hostility towards Canada's resource sector, especially as a mayor of a British Columbian city, since British Columbia relies so heavily on natural resources for its economic development. But there's also just Mark Carney himself, right, as Liberal leader, and before, when he was the governor of Bank of England. For years, he was the global face of pushing carbon pricing, and we explore this in our series, Mark Carney's Values, where we dived into his 2021 book. But as a former governor of the Bank of Canada and also the UN climate envoy, if I might add. He pushed carbon taxes as the backbone of climate policy, and in his book, he called carbon pricing the essential tool for net zero governance. And he even praised Trudeau's carbon tax as a model for the world. Yet now we know when he's seeking political power, he's promised to repeal the consumer carbon tax, but in actuality, he's only reduced it to zero while the legislation still remains in place. So both of these figures, Robertson and Carney himself, the leader of the party, showcase how there's a lot of people who still support carbon taxes and the environmental policies of the Trudeau government still in the Carney Liberals today. With a majority of contraband tobacco entering Canada from the U.S., Canadian border officials are ill-equipped to tackle the issue, allowing organized crime groups to take advantage of enforcement gaps. Danny Fournier, Senior Manager of Illicit Trade Prevention for Rothmans, Benson and Hedges Canada, is calling for heightened security measures to combat the illicit tobacco trade and its production, which fuels organized crime groups operating within Canada. Fournier was the recipient of the Governor-General of Canada's Police Exemplary Service Medal with over 25 years of law enforcement experience, where he oversaw organized crime, contraband tobacco, and drug enforcement operations. In an interview with True North at a conference on preventing illicit online trade, Fournier said organized crime counts on the contraband tobacco market to stay alive. Fournier explained that as long as criminal organizations can make easy money from trafficking illegal tobacco, public safety will suffer. He said the majority of contraband tobacco comes across the border from the U.S. to supply illegal manufacturers here in Canada. Fournier said he thinks the federal government should increase the product vetting capabilities of the Canadian Border Services Agency and give the RCMP more of a role in tobacco enforcement. Though busts occur where tobacco is the only contraband seized, unmarked cigarettes and tobacco products are often confiscated alongside drugs and guns, including deadly narcotics like fentanyl. Fournier warns consumers that any tobacco product that doesn't have a marked filter, has colorful packaging, or simply comes in a big Ziploc bag is considered contraband and likely has been sourced by organized crime groups such as the Italian Mafia in Montreal. Clayton, you attended this conference there in Toronto. What were some of the other concerns raised about this issue by participants?
Yeah, so the tobacco company created a method to report illicit trade online to sales platforms and law enforcement. So the private company, of course, focuses on making sure illegal tobacco products aren't cutting into their market. But while scanning the internet for these posts, they often come across a ton of other illegal sales, including guns and drugs such as fentanyl and cocaine. And Fournier mentioned that because of the lax rules or the lack of enforcement, rather, these sellers are becoming very brazen, including selling openly multiple rifles on various marketplaces like Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace. So he noted that traditional law enforcement is just unequipped to deal with illegal activities online because it lacks a sustained online presence. Enforcement wasn't designed around the internet, so there's a lot of gaps there. Another issue brought up was that there aren't clear definitions of things such as the allowable limit for personal use of non-smoke products such as Zyn. So even when law enforcement does come across large amounts of Zyn, it's hard to discern what amount the government actually bans. So they often let the perps go. More importantly, to most Canadians, he highlighted the fact that wherever organized crime operates, other crimes go up, running public safety, but also the drugs being imported by these groups. Often they are imported in the same truck as illicit tobacco products, but these drugs help fuel overdose deaths in Canada, especially as it pertains to opioids such as fentanyl. I also spoke with a representative of Canada's convenience store owners, Anne Kothawala, and she told me that government bans on tobacco products used to lower the risk of tobacco or get people off of it, such as nicotine pouches, just drive Canadians to illegal markets. Also, high taxes on products mean licensed stores sell less and Canadians end up going online, or even to, and probably more frequently to, First Nations retailers where they buy untaxed tobacco which is, of course, illegal for non-Indigenous status Canadians to buy. She said when convenience stores are forced to sell less, many have to close their doors. And of course, convenience stores are in every federal riding. And with their closures would come and do continue to come as their closures rise, impacts to the Canadian economy. So the Liberal government's high taxes and steep regulations are actually driving funds into the hands of organized criminals, such as the Italian mafia in Montreal was noted at the conference, and to continue their operations across the border and into Canada.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.